Hello and welcome. My name is Lynn O'Hara and I'm the Director of Programs at National History Day. I'm excited to join you for our 2021 editions of Ask an NEH Expert. This is a skill series where we talk about skills that our NHD students are learning to master along with professionals in the field who work with and practice these skills every day. This program is part of our partnership with the National Endowment for the Humanities. So in order to begin, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague at the NEH, Jason Harshman. Jason, thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Lynn, and thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being with us for this video series. I'm Jason Harshman, a program officer in the Division of Education at the National Endowment for the Humanities. Since the 1970s, the NEH has been a leading funder and partner with National History Day, including the development of free resources available at our K-12 website, Excitement. Each year, the NEH awards a special prize for working with the historical newspaper database Chronicling America and top projects with an NEH NHD Scholar Medal. It is our pleasure to once again partner with National History Day on the production of this Ask an NEH Expert video series. And also, we are very excited to have Dr. Jeffrey Ludwig, the Director of Education at the Seward House Museum in Auburn, New York. Dr. Ludwig earned his PhD in history at the University of Rochester and previously worked at the Office of the City Historian in Rochester, New York. It was while working in the archives at the University of Rochester as a graduate student that Jeff first encountered an amazing repository of primary sources that made the world of the Seward family come to life. The Seward House was awarded a CARES Act grant by the National Endowment for the Humanities to develop digital resources and expand access to their holdings for public schools and the public. Thank you, Jeff, for being with us as part of this video series, and we look forward to your conversation today about wide research. Lynn?
Jeff, thank you so much for joining us. Before we kind of get into our questions about research, I understand that you have an artifact with us to kind of get our discussion started. So what have you got?
That's right. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you so much, Jason, and the NEH and National History Day for having me on. I have brought what is probably every single one of our visitors. In a normal year, we get about 16,000 visitors a year to a historic house museum, the incredibly well-preserved home of former Secretary of State William Henry Seward, who we'll talk about a bit today, his home. Everyone's favorite thing, some people come back after 50 years since their last visit and remember it, the bloody sheet. What I'm going to talk to you about today is the Lincoln assassination, in a sense, a story I'm sure many of you are familiar with, April 14th, 1865. But President Lincoln was not supposed to have been the only victim that night in one of the last acts of a bloody American Civil War. His faithful friend and confidant Seward was marked for death as well, was viciously stabbed nearly to death in his bed, doors down from the White House, was essentially left for dead by his assailant. And what remains from that night are many sources, of which we'll talk about, and this bloody bed sheet, which if you were to unfold it, you'd see all the places where the 7-inch blade went through and still stained today, as it's now been for 150 plus years, with the lifeblood of William Seward.
That's a little gory and a little cool at the same time, but that's what makes history fun. Okay, so if we start with that artifact, but we've got to kind of rewind the story because research is a process and it takes a while. So when you're planning research, can you tell us what you keep in mind? So kind of like, what prep work do you do to know that what different kind of sources might be available on a topic you're choosing to research?
Right, that's a great question. The hardest thing about a research project of any size can be getting started, right? Just like there's nothing more terrifying than the blinking cursor on a blank page. It's thinking about how do I begin an undertaking as big as the one that many of these students are about to begin. It's okay, but that's kind of part of the fun. It's a blank slate. You can literally do anything. So when I'm getting started on a project, I think about casting the widest possible net. That means going into libraries when you can do that safely, searching online, but trying to assemble, compile as many related secondary sources, which can be a great gateway into primary sources. And then these primary sources, these direct objects, artifacts, accounts that trace us back to the moment in time we want to explore. Just be, as one of my college professors put it, promiscuous in your habits and your searching. Don't turn anything away. I think we'll talk a bit today about there can be such a thing as too many sources, too many books, quantity versus quality. But in the early going, it's okay to assemble voraciously and promiscuously. And then you'll be able to drill down. So start, even if you know you want to focus on something very, very narrow. For me, maybe trying to frame and analyze and assess and interpret the assassination attempt against Seward, I wouldn't begin by jumping right into any book I could find about just that thing. I'd probably start big. Biographies, accounts maybe of the Civil War, and then I would narrow my scope down. And this is where you start to drill down. Maybe you think you're taking on a project like something like an assassination attempt. You're going to find as you get into that, there's so many layers of complexity within it that as you assemble more sources, you'll be able to narrow your parameters, narrow your focus, and these sources often lead to other sources. Secondary sources have citations, bibliographies, endnotes that turn you on to more sources. There are references and primary sources to other accounts, diaries, letters, so many newspaper accounts of the assassination. So simply starting big and narrowing down as you go.
I think that's really important, that you have to kind of keep an open mind. You don't want to be too narrow when you begin. Now, we talk in kind of historian circles about having wide research on a topic. Can you explain what wide research is?
Sure. So wide research, simply put, is finding the widest variety of source materials that would be available that would shed light on the subject that you've chosen to pursue. So in the case of the assassination attempt against William Seward, April 14th, 1865, there are 5 very good Seward biographies, a great place to start out. Those are secondary sources, scholarly articles. Doris Kearns Goodwin's excellent book, Team of Rivals, on the Lincoln cabinet during the Civil War. There are 2 good secondary sources. One's called Manhunt by James Swanson, one's called Killing Lincoln, that are sort of ways into this field. So wide research would be trying to incorporate as many varieties of source materials as you can. Finding the scholarly articles and the books that are linked to those stories, and looking for as many primary sources as you can too. So in the case of the assassination attempt, there were a number of newspaper accounts. Many members of Lincoln's cabinet came to Seward. They kept diaries. They wrote about what it was like to step in that room that night, how they understood what was happening in that moment. The Seward family archives, Jason mentioned my first foray with the Sewards was in their archives, letters between members of the family about what happened. Mr. Seward's young daughter, who was in the room, wrote an 8-page diary entry that night. So all sorts of primary sources like that, newspapers, magazines, ordinary Americans trying to grapple and make sense of a chaotic time, which might sound familiar. This is nothing new. And we make sense of this by writing it down, talking about it, and we can recall that moment by finding those sources. So again, simply put, the widest variety of sources you can, and then your job will next be to distill them down and find the ones that you need to tell the story you want to tell or make the argument you want to make.
You make a really good point. You shouldn't rely on any one type of source. You shouldn't just use newspaper articles or just use photographs, but it's mixing all of those together. That's sometimes a challenge for our NHD students. Now, one thing that sometimes NHD students get stuck in, especially this time of year, is trying to figure out the difference between research quantity and having a lot of sources, because sometimes by this time of year students have a lot of sources, versus research quality. So can you talk a little bit about how you whittle that down so that you have quality sources in your research?
That's a really great question. And for me, I find that the more time I spend with the subject, the more I began to realize who some of the authorities on it are, which books are the gold standard books on Lincoln and Seward, which sources are the most reliable, can you trust the most? And I do want to come back and talk about how both primary and secondary sources can be misleading, sometimes on purpose, sometimes unintentionally, and that's why it's important. A wide variety allows you to make your own composite, form your own critical judgments. But it's really true. There are accounts of historians who have wasted careers away because they cannot help themselves. They just keep collecting and collecting, like that early stage of research. And they feel like they can't sit down and put pen to paper or start filling up that Word document until they've turned over every stone, read every book. And it can become a sort of self-perpetuating cycle of procrastination and never getting started. And it definitely can feel overwhelming. At a certain point, you have to stop that early stage collecting and move to analyzing, assessing, and beginning to build the composite story you want to tell. And this is when it's great to ask an expert. There are authorities who would be so happy to help you, but you can form your own judgments too. As you're researching, you are absolutely going to find that you're going to see the same voices and sources coming up over and over again. The same 2 or 3 secondary sources, biographies, monographs, articles might be referred to by everybody. Everybody uses those as a starting point. So maybe it's a good idea for you to do that too. Everybody refers to the same core documents. In my case, the diary entry, the court transcripts, the family letters. Everybody looks at them, so I should have to as well. And then I'll branch out and find more. But it's certainly a great idea always to ask your teachers, ask librarians, consult the experts. If you're looking at the same 2 or 3 historians and you think maybe these are the ones who carry the most weight in the field, Google them. If they're teaching at a university or college, look them up. Maybe correspond with them. I get emails all the time from all over the country from middle school and high school students who have found me and are working on Seward, and it's usually a scholar's pleasure. They want their work to be out there in the world to work with students of all ages. But check with your librarians and teachers. Can I trust this historian? What's his or her reputation? And that's all part of this process of folding so much information. History is so complex. It contains multitudes. And as Lynn has suggested, one of the traps is essentializing it, thinking there's sort of 1 or 2 ways of looking at it and closing your mind to other perspectives. So bringing in as many voices, secondary sources, primary sources, and people in your world that you trust to point you in the right directions, having these conversations are the best way to sort of make your choices of what are going to be the building block sources you want to use to tell your story.
Well, I think it's important too, sometimes when our students are working on editing those annotated bibliographies, to say, you know what, this source was really interesting, but it's not really helpful.
Yes.
And, you know, a bibliography doesn't always contain everything you looked at. It's what you used for your project. So sometimes editing goes a long way, because if there's too much stuff, it's hard to kind of see the diamonds if they're crowded. If you pull out the things that really weren't useful in the end, that can really help your judges see the best research, kind of that gold standard piece that you talk about. Okay, so we understand what wide research is. Let's transition and talk a little bit about why it's important. Can you explain to us why it's important and how taking this approach can really create a quality project and help us better understand what happened or the people involved in a historical event?
Yes, great questions. And so, as I mentioned a bit earlier, you have to be critical when you look at sources, even secondary sources, even the most trusted and vaunted. Historians have their own biases. They have their own agendas. They have their own blind spots. So secondary sources, while they tend to be authoritative and largely very trustworthy, don't exist in some perfect vacuum of objectivity, neutrality, and truth. Everybody reads the same evidence differently. And we're talking about evidence the way a detective might look at evidence and clues, trying to build a case from a scene. That's essentially what historians are trying to do too. They take their primary sources, the direct firsthand evidence and clues, try to build this composite to lay out an account of what happened, why it happened, who the principals were, what their motivations were, why things unfolded in the way that they did. And you might think about secondary sources as basically, if you're looking at something from history, it's kind of a cold case, right? This happened a long time ago in the past. In some of your cases, there might be no living people left in this country who were directly there when whatever it is that you're studying happened, or whoever you're studying lived their life. So you're looking at the files of those who came before you. And secondary sources, I don't want to mislead you, historians and scholars spend and dedicate years of their life, which is why secondary sources are great. They save you a lot of legwork. Somebody has already compiled a lot of the facts, the sources. They've made their own composite, and you can take that for what it's worth, but take it with a grain of salt, because most historians have, as I say, blind spots. And what's really interesting is you get 2, 3, 4, 5 books on the same subject. You'll find that within the pages of these works of history, historians are arguing and they're disagreeing with each other over the same basic set of facts. Everyone reads the court transcripts a little bit differently, or looks at the bloody sheet in a different light, a different context. And so even historians, the best, don't tend to agree on how we can interpret the same basic raw data, the evidence, the primary sources of history. And you want to weigh in just like they did. Study the same evidence, look at the old case files, the secondary sources, see what you agree with, see how they drew their conclusions, see if you draw the same conclusions based on the same evidence, and the really fun part. As you're playing detective, sometimes you have that eureka moment. You find your own source that has never been seen before, or your mind clicks and you see a spin or a way of framing it that no one's thought of before. You join that scholarly conversation, you put your own stamp on it. Now, another great thing about wide research is, and looking at primary sources, we are so much more attuned today in the 21st century to marginalized voices than historians were in generations past, or even people tended to be in society in the past. And so in the case of William Seward, often overlooked were the voices of witnesses. An African-American man who saw a lot of the attack on Seward was given less credence than white people who saw this happen. Women. Seward's young daughter was in the room when it happened, but her account was given less sway than a white man who was there. So we can recall marginalized voices and bring them from the margins to the centers of the story and find all these different perspectives, which provide us the rich tapestry. And within this rich tapestry lies the truth which you're seeking. So find as many voices as you can. Primary sources are the way to do that. And then you fold them all in to the story that you want to tell.
I think that's really important. I think it's important that our students remember that both primary and secondary sources have a perspective, and that we want our students to develop their own arguments. We tell that student voice in History Day, where we hear what you think and what your evidence has led you to conclude. And I think it's important that sometimes it lines up with other historians, sometimes it's different. And that's okay, because that's part of the process. As long as the evidence backs the argument, you can go ahead and make the case. Okay, so a lot of our students love primary sources, right? It's history. How can you not love primary sources? But secondary sources and artifacts at museums can also be helpful. Can you talk a little bit about how you use secondary sources and artifacts to inform your research?
Yeah, thank you, Lynn. And as I said, secondary sources are wonderful things in that they offer you pretty much a pre-packaged amount of work that you no longer really have to do. There's a really great biography of William Seward by a man named Walter Starr. He spent years working on it, and he provides vital context whenever I need to look at some aspect of William Seward's career. And Mr. Seward was a New York governor, a U.S. senator, an abolitionist, a friend of Harriet Tubman, whose home was a house on the Underground Railroad, who ran for president against Lincoln. And despite that adversity and the bitterness of the campaign, became one of his closest friends, a man who helped draft the Emancipation Proclamation, a man who would later on buy Alaska, and of course a man who was supposed to die with Lincoln, because John Wilkes Booth and these Confederate sympathizers thought he was essentially synonymous, the same as Lincoln. They were so tight. For the Union really to fail, both men would have to die. And I don't always have time to spend years plumbing through the archives or the newspaper records, diaries, to try to recall Seward and the Emancipation Proclamation, or maybe the assassination. So it's a jumping off point that provides context, but then from that context, you see the work that that scholar is doing. They show you their work. If they're a good scholar that wants your trust and respect, they will show you how they're drawing conclusions through their citations and bibliography. Maybe they're using footnotes or internal citations or endnotes, but they will show you the work. They'll show you what primary sources they read, why they're reading them the way they're reading them, and why they're drawing their conclusions. And then it becomes incumbent upon you, it becomes your job, not just to uncritically absorb that and regurgitate it, but to follow in those footsteps, see those primary sources, and see if they read them right. And to come back to my last point, primary sources lie all the time. They're deliberately misreading in some cases. When you are, think about your own footprint you're leaving in this world, whether it's on social media or the way sort of you leave a mark about your life. Sometimes you're putting your best foot forward, you're filtering, right? All these filters. That is so true as well. Looking at the court testimony, people want to cast themselves in flattering lights. In the case of the assassin, he wants to defend himself, so he's making his own argument for how he wasn't guilty, or he was not guilty by reasons of insanity. Letters always, usually try to frame the person who's writing them in the best possible light. So it becomes your job then, take all these primary and secondary sources and look for big patterns. Look for undeniable moments of truth. Any one source can be misleading, can distort the truth, can lie to you, but the more you assemble, the more you wrap into the woof of your story, the harder it is to say, well, that's clearly not true because that's just somebody spinning. When you assemble all this evidence, and secondary sources are a great way in, that's when you get at the truth of the matter that you're really looking to find in this project.
I think that's all really good advice. Now, I've got a question for you, and I've been there. I'm guessing you've been there. Sometimes our students get to a point where they feel like they're stuck, right? They've done a lot of research and they just don't know kind of where to go with it. And they kind of feel like they found everything there possibly could be to find, and they don't know where to go next. When you get stuck in research, what do you do to help get yourself unstuck?
Well, the first thing you should do is like take a walk. Like give yourself a break. If you're finding yourself getting frustrated, getting stymied, sometimes it is okay to check out, which is why you should never take your deadline down to the wire. It's good to always be working ahead because you'll give yourself that time at the end to disconnect, to disengage, to decompress. But once you've done that, once you've sort of squared and centered your head, this is when it's okay to maybe to fall back on some of those earlier habits. Maybe you pick up a book, and even though, yes, you've already read, say, if you're me, 5 different accounts of the assassination, how many more action sequences of who stood where during the stabbing will help you? Maybe this is the time something clicks. Or maybe you just read bibliographies or references. Maybe you find that source that your eyes glossed over the 3rd or 4th time. Or maybe there's a primary source that's kind of been bugging you and you go back to it. Maybe you read, in my case, Fanny Seward, the secretary's daughter's diary again. Maybe this time you read the entry before, the entry after. Maybe you start expanding your scope into the letters. Anything that can sort of help you click and connect. And if that doesn't work, if turning up some new leaves doesn't actually generate that spark that you need, this is when it's okay to reach out for help. People tend to think that historians live in these lonely little worlds of dusty old archives and writing garrets, and it's just them and their computers and their stacks of books and articles, and it's this lonely life of you and the work. Well, that's not true at all. There's a community of scholars out there who want to help you. This is when I think it's great to reach out for a vital lifeline. It can be a student in your class. Hey, can you read a draft of what I'm working on? What do you think? Let me bounce some ideas off you. Talk to your classmates, talk to your teachers, talk to your families, talk to people that you respect and trust. In my case, as a historian, it might be colleagues in the field. And often it's this community dialogue that can take you to the next level. So there's all sorts of ways that you can try to find that vital inspiration or that next source, whatever it takes to make you have a leap forward. And sometimes it's okay if your writing isn't good. I had a professor tell me, write a page every day, you'll write a book a year. Sometimes your writing is going to come together, the research is going to come together. Put something on the paper, you can always delete it later, and you never know what you're going to find when you make the effort.
I think that's really important. And I would also add one more person to your list: librarians.
Librarians,
School
thank you, Lynn.
librarians, public librarians can be amazing resources, and they often work in networks for different topics. So I would not hesitate to show your work or drafts of your work to those people to see what other suggestions they might have. Okay, finally, we're at the stage, students are getting ready to go to college. So they're taking their research and they're building their exhibit boards, creating their documentaries, their performances, their papers, their websites, and they're kind of at a point of transition. Once you complete your work in your job, how do you showcase the work that you've done at the Seward House Museum?
Great question, Lynn. All sorts of ways. And so those of you doing this, if you enter this community of scholars or want to just visit for a while, historians really aren't siloed. They are in constant communication with each other. So for me at the Seward House Museum, a long research project will likely result in perhaps a new exhibit. We just opened a new one up on Harriet Tubman and William Seward in their time working together on the Underground Railroad and their friendship afterwards. The Bloody Sheet was at the very center of an exhibit we had on the assassination night. So exhibitions for public interpretation and consideration, basically sharing, disseminating, putting that work out in the world where it can do good. Writing scholarly essays, articles, or maybe not even scholarly. Maybe you're just shouting it out from social media. Oh my gosh, I can't believe this amazing thing, because it's relevant today. We often think the past is a foreign country. Why does this even matter? In my case, I think looking at something like the assassination, an act of direct political violence, matters more than ever in these circumstances. The past can be can be quite useful, drawing lessons and wisdom for how we can best work together today. Scholars get together all the time for conferences, and the world of online scholarship makes instant communication possible. Scholars are having conversations now on social media. I've seen historians at the top of their game arguing back and forth in 40 comment chunks on Facebook. So there's any number of ways that you can shine a bright spotlight on the work that you've done. And that's exactly your job, because what you'll be doing is making your own original and unique contribution to the historical record, changing the way we understand the past, and in so doing, changing the way we live in the present.
Well, I think that's a great place to end here, because I really appreciate the fact that you are helping to remind our students of the agency and the power that they have through the National History Day program to share their work out with a wider audience. And on that point, I'm going to say a huge thank you to Jeff Ludwig from the Seward House Museum, and I'm going to turn things back to Jason Harshman at the NEH. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you, Lynn. And Jeff, again, yes, thank you very much. We're so happy with the work that's been going on at the Seward House with the NEH CARES grant, and we really do appreciate you being part of this Ask an NEH Expert video series. I thought the inverted triangle example that you gave about how to start wide and narrow through questioning is so helpful. And absolutely, reach out to scholars, reach out to librarians. There's a whole network out there that helps you to engage. So thank you so much. Thank you again to National History Day. And on behalf of the National Endowment for the Humanities, to the parents, teachers, and students working on their projects, we wish you all the best.